I would like to begin this week with an announcement. The idea for Thal as well is simple. I want long conversations with interesting people on a variety of topics. There are lots of philosophy podcasts out there, but not many do this. This should have some element of current affairs also, because we need a forum where philosophy can respond to the most pressing issues of the day. I would like to ask you two things. First, for your feedback. I would be interested in hearing ideas about how to make the podcast better. Are there events or ideas you would like me to talk about? Is there somebody who you think would make a good guest? Would you be interested in, for example, if I spoke to a bunch of different people about a specific theme? Like if I did a series on power or governance or free speech. Should the podcast maybe be longer or shorter? You can contact me at talaswellpodcast@gmail.com. I'll respond to all your emails, even if it does take me a while. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Philocity, and you can like our Facebook page. Please subscribe and leave a nice review on iTunes. Most importantly, please tell your friends. Recommend the podcast to anyone who you think might be interested. This week, I'm talking to Michael Baranawski. He's a political scientist from Northern Kentucky University. We talked about Mike's intellectual origins, the political philosopher Edmund Burke, the legacy of John McCain, the possibility of socialism in America, and of course President Trump. As well, we spoke about forthcoming congressional elections. Mike is really smart and an exceptionally clear thinker, and I was really pleased to have him on the show. I also have to thank him, as we well and truly nicked his old theme tune. Now, over to the show.
Thank you for being with us, Mike. So I got a bunch of questions I want to ask you about American politics. You are a political scientist at the University of Kentucky, is that right?
Northern Kentucky University.
Northern Kentucky. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So the first thing I want to ask you is about that term briefly. You're happy with the appellation political scientist. Why the scientist? Why do, I guess, political theorists or political philosophers call themselves political scientists? Because I guess political scientists don't do what conventional scientists do?
Well, I think that there's a good reason for the term, and it very much relates to our outlook on politics. And so when we study politics, we attempt to, as best as we can, use the scientific method to do so. And so it's really more about our methodology and how we approach answering questions about politics. We're guided by empirical methods, things that are testable, that are falsifiable, and that there's a community to sort of check our work and comment on it. And so really it's that method that attaches to the term more than anything else.
Yeah, so it's a question of how you study the activity of politics, whereas I guess politics itself might not necessarily be scientific.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, it's probably quite the opposite. It can be quite irrational at times. But how you look at it, you see yourselves as adopting a scientific attitude.
Yeah, and you know, in doing so, we hope to the best of our ability to put our own biases in check to a certain extent. And I think that's really one of the big differences between how political scientists look at politics and how, well, non-political scientists or non-social scientists look at it is that because we have that method, I think it's helpful to us to give us a more objectivity. Now, when we're just sort of commenting on politics without using that method, we can be every bit as irrational as anyone else, of course. But when we really focus on using that method in our academic work, I think that's the goal, certainly.
So, yeah, and I mean, that's so important. I mean, I've been reading a lot of Daniel Kahneman recently.
Right.
So I guess behavioral psychologist, I guess. And I mean, one of the things, I mean, he pretty much proves that it is like almost impossible to set aside biases.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's something, you know, in teaching, when I tell my students, is the question is not if somebody is biased. The question is how much and in what direction, really.
Right. Yeah. I think Marx says something to that effect, right? I mean, I think he says, you know, you're never more ideological than when you say you're not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, now, what I want to talk to you now is a bit about your, I guess your background, because this interests me, and I've gleaned most of this from listening to your show, The Politics Guys. You don't have a big presence on Google, Mike, I'm afraid. But right. So, in a sense, your biography or your narrative, I guess, in a sense, is a story of you setting aside biases, perhaps, shall we say, because you were, when you were younger, quite right-wing, I think, and you have become progressively more left-wing. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I started out, I would say very, very far right, fairly stridently far right. I was quite a pain to many of my professors who I accused oftentimes of being communists or other things like that. But yeah, it was a process really of, I was fairly right wing up until really I started graduate school. And then I like to think of what happened as I was exposed to that scientific method I talked about and sort of a much more comprehensive analysis of politics as a science. It made me start to question some of my pre-existing beliefs. And while I haven't become, I wouldn't really say I'd become strongly left-wing, I'd certainly moved to what I'd call center-left, at least in the American context, which I would expect by most probably European standards would still put me somewhat right of center, I would guess slightly.
That seems to be quite a shorthand that what Americans, at least in the American context, consider to be centre-left, Europeans consider to be centre-right. Can I ask how far right were you? I mean, you weren't a Nazi, like, for example.
No, nothing like that. I was, I guess I would say I was a proud Reagan Republican. I was very much in favor of limited government and a strong stance against, at that point, the Soviet threat, and very concerned about communism and threats to freedom and that sort of thing. So that's where I stood. And honestly, another part of my evolution on this was I feel that I think it's fairly uncontroversial in most quarters to say that the Republican Party and the conservative movement in the United States changed considerably over the last 30 or so years, to the point where now people who, well, back then would have been considered fairly far right are now not anywhere close to far right. So in other words, the right moved much further right. And the left did maybe move a little bit further left, but not nearly as much as the right. So really the ground shifted underneath me as well. And as some people put it, I didn't leave the Republican Party left me. And I sort of have a certain amount of sympathy with that argument.
So when you were younger, in graduate school, I mean, you speak there about, supporting Reagan. I mean, and you certainly were not alone in that in the United States at the time. I mean, a hugely popular President Reagan when he came to power. I mean, I think he won pretty much the vast majority of states, did he not?
He had just a massive electoral victory, especially in 1984, one of the greatest in American presidential election history.
Yeah, but I'm wondering, where were you on social issues? I mean, would you have considered yourself right wing on issues like, say, abortion or death penalty or things like that?
I really was to a certain extent, but again, and this is where exposure to more information, I feel, changed my mind on a lot of social issues. I was very much for a very limited, what we call sometimes social safety net. But a lot of my beliefs were premised on, I guess what I would call this sort of libertarian-esque understanding of human beings as being extraordinarily rational and able to make very good decisions about their long-term interest. And, you mentioned Danny Kahneman and a number of other behavioral psychologists and also economists who've been doing this work have pretty clearly, I think, demonstrated that in a lot of ways, that's just not how most human beings are most of the time. And so if you have a philosophy that's premised on that behavior, I think when you realize that behavior is not how real people act, then the logical thing to do is to re-examine your philosophy.
Right, and I guess that's where it starts for you then, right? Because I mean, that's your story is interesting, and as I said in our correspondence prior to this, that I mean, your story should really be essential reading for those on the left, because you're someone who's come a long way. I think that's fair to say. You've come a long way from where you are to where you are now.
Yeah, I'd certainly like to think so.
Yeah, I mean, also, so did you have a religious background? Did you have did you have a military background? Is that correct?
I had both a religious and a military background, and of course, those are two institutions, especially Catholicism in the United States and the military, that are, I would say, strongly conservative, and those things sort of, I think, reinforce.
Over here too.
Okay, there you go. So yeah, and I was sort of immersed in that culture, and so I think that also sort of reinforced my some conservative viewpoints, and my parents were fairly conservative, and my neighborhood and that sort of thing, and all those things I think work together.
Yeah. So I mean, can I ask? I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you a personal question, Michael. Now, so we can
sure, go ahead.
If we can edit it out afterwards if you deem it inappropriate. So, did you, when you made these changes, did it affect your relationships with your friends, with your family, with colleagues?
Well, I guess I would say it didn't really affect my relationships with colleagues so much, because academia tends to be a fairly liberal outside of the sciences and business and so forth. And so, if anything, it made my relationships with my colleagues, less fraught. But with my family, I think to a certain extent, my parents were a little surprised, I guess, at my change, or they might consider it my conversion. I don't know, but so yeah, I guess to a certain extent, and I guess there were some people who would say, well, it seems like you sort of adapted to the crowd you were running with, and I think it's important to say that there's maybe an element of truth to that. Is what we've seen is that people do tend to do that sort of thing, but I also think that there's a strong grounds in logic and reasoning that I made the change that I did.
Okay, thank you. So one of the things you mentioned in relation to your initial libertarianism is your belief in the rationality of politics. So maybe you might now think that libertarians are less rational than they propose to be, but you still do have that, don't you? You still have your show of the Politics Guys is about trying to bring sanity, calmness, and a serene detachedness to political analysis.
Yeah, I think this maybe works on two levels. The issue I have with libertarians in general is that they have a largely incorrect view of human nature. And so if you're premising your philosophy on an incorrect view of human nature, that in and of itself is not rational. And so I think it's possible to practice a rational politics, but to do so, you have to have a good, reasonable understanding of how people behave. If you don't have that, then the whole project sort of falls apart.
Right. So, when I talk to my students, I teach some political philosophy at undergraduate level, and what I know maybe you do this as well, but when I start with them, I try to tell them that politics is largely irrational. Mm-hmm. The activity of politics, that is, we can think about it rationally, perhaps, but it's also a question. And you've alluded to it there. You've said that you have to start out with an accurate view of what human beings are like. And then you can begin to think about what type of society you want if you move on from that. I find a lot of my students, maybe you find the same, they tend to look at politics as sort of, I think, more ethical. They start with their ethics and then they go, well, what type of society should we take from that? Or can we build from that? Like, what is it? Should we have a welfare state? Should we have harsh drug laws? Whatever, Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and that's sort of I would argue that that's a problem that we have, and that people understandably so, start from their own personal ethics, experiences, and so forth. And what I found is that the more that we base everything on that, the more difficult it is to sort of understand that, well, not everyone experiences the world in the same way. And so if again, I think a lot of, coming back to the libertarian point, I think a lot of libertarians are very rational and intelligent people. And I sometimes kid my libertarian friends, well, if everyone were like you, I think libertarianism would work out great, but everyone's not. And what I found, especially in recent years, is there seems to be an increasing difficulty for people to put themselves into the worldview of the other. And I think unless we can do that, unless we make a real effort to do that on a regular basis, then it's going to be very difficult to come to compromises, to come to, shared solutions to problems, which is, I think, at the heart of democratic governance.
I think you're absolutely right. But I mean, how do you begin to do that? How do you begin to put yourself into the shoes of the other person in a political sense and see where other people are coming from? Especially if things are so compromised as they are, I think, by technology and social media and the like.
I think that's a great question and an incredibly difficult thing to come to a satisfactory solution to. And it's one of the reasons why, I started a podcast a few years ago, because I was seeing exactly this happening. And I thought, well, why aren't there more forums for conservatives and liberals to try to talk things out? And because of my, I guess, unique background, I had, long-time friends who saw the world differently from the way I did, but there was that reservoir of goodwill that you build up over decades of friendship. And so I thought, well, maybe we can use this as a way to civilly discuss our differences. And that's kind of the genesis for what I was trying to do with the podcast. And I really think that's at the heart of it, is you need to assume a level of goodwill and good intention on the part of your ideological opponent, if you will, that they want essentially the same things for themselves and their families and their loved ones, but they just are trying to get there from different ways, from different fundamental premises. And if we don't believe that, if we choose to view the other as evil or stupid or some combination thereof, well, I think we're lost right from the beginning.
Yeah, so it's about adopting a principle of charity.
Yes.
About your opponent's views or someone who's different views, and it's so difficult, Michael, when you have people, I guess, trying to climb the same mountain from different sides.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, absolutely. And I think, you mentioned social media. It makes it so much more difficult because, of course, in social media, every comment is almost by its very nature of the medium decontextualized. And so people read into these comments their greatest fears and concerns about the other side. And I think it's much harder to take that charitable view. And so I think that's a big part of why we're in the mess we're in now.
Do you feel sometimes that you're swimming against the tide?
Oh gosh, yeah, absolutely. And I think when I look at what the most popular political podcasts are, for instance, and there are these things that really preach to the choir, and it's not the kind of thing that a conservative would ever listen to or a liberal will ever listen to. They're just people feeding red meat to the base, and I get why that's so popular, and it's so difficult because I think if you push against it, you're pushing against that sort of fundamental tribalism of human nature. And I think it's a tough thing to do, but I think it's a battle really worth engaging in.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, and tribalism, that word you use, is, tribalism is enjoyable. It's easy to run with the crowd.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. So, one of the things then, that I wanted to talk to you, about, and I think this fits in with your own backstory as well. And this is about John McCain, and I think because John McCain is, I think, someone who, how shall I put it? Well, firstly, he's someone that I think Europeans could pay attention to, because I think he's a very significant placeholder for how American politics operates, right?
Sure.
So, and also I think you had I think you were on the, you campaigned for John McCain, I think, at once upon a time. So, I was wondering, maybe, could you please tell us, what is it about, John McCain? And, he's passed away recently. What is it about his character that is so, I guess,
sure,
significant or symbolic about American politics?
No, I think he represented a a type or an approach to politics that sadly I find to be in great decline. There's this notion, this phrase I love, the happy warrior, the person who throws him or herself into the fray with a great deal of relish, but not in a sort of a mean-spirited, vindictive way, who at the end of the day can understand that we share a common humanity. And that doesn't mean they don't enjoy the cut and thrust of battle, but that there's a certain fundamental decency that both sides observe. And that's what makes the game, if you will, playable. And John McCain, I think, greatly exemplified that sort of thing. And in fact, there were plenty of people in the 1970s, 1980s, even into the early 1990s in American politics who you could find who had that sort of attitude toward politics. But now it's become this sort of zero-sum game where you not only have to battle your opponent on policy, but you have to demonize your opponent. And that, I think, makes it so much more difficult to recover from a loss when everything is personal and everything is, again, this sort of zero-sum game, and your opponent is this evil entity who must be vanquished at all costs entirely.
I think, I mean, he was McCain, the character was. I mean, I was in the United States a couple of weeks ago. I was in Texas, and one of the things I noticed, I visited the state capitol in Austin, and I said I did politics tours, and basically like a massive nerd. But he was what I noticed, right, was all of the flags were at half-mast on public buildings, right? So that to me says that that is an indicator of the passing of something very, very significant. Now, I'm not really interested in the partisan views of what McCain was about, right?
Right.
I mean, personally, I probably found him quite distasteful, but that's neither here nor there. But that pressed home to me. Those flags flying at half-mast for this, what was a military hero. I mean, he was factually a military hero. That this was a significant man, or this was someone who was who really, really spoke to America.
Yeah. No, I agree. And this is part of the problem that I have with President Trump, is that sort of mean-spirited type of, I will not even acknowledge the decency, the humanity of my opponents. I will just delegitimize them. And that to me is a fundamental break with how politics needs to be practiced if we are to have some sort of a cohesive society. And that doesn't, that's not just in American context.
Sure.
I think we see this, I think, in a number of other countries where, authoritarian leaders rise up who refuse to even legitimize alternative views. And that to me is incredibly troubling.
So, there's something. Do you think there was something ultimately tragic about the figure of McCain? I mean, the reason I asked that is I know that you're a fan of what his name is, Infinite Jest, David Foster Wallace.
David Foster Wallace, yeah.
Yeah. So, and he wrote what I consider to be at least a minor political masterpiece, which was Up Simba, his essay on the McCain. The McCain campaign, the McCain campaign in 2004, I'm guessing. Is that right? 2000.
That was the 2000 campaign. Yeah, that was a great piece. Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's absolutely a really unique piece of political writing. But in that, I think Foster Wallace's sort of perspective is he tries to examine questions of sincerity, right? And you got the feeling when reading that, and I don't know if you got this when you were campaigning at the time, but that McCain was someone struggling with the sort of the more cynical side of politics. And as the campaign grew dirtier and dirtier, and he was hit hard in that campaign, if I recall, he became more and more willing to, go to towards the dark arts. So in some sense, right. That's why I think he might be a tragic figure, and that's why he was lamented so much.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that you mentioned struggle. And I think that's very important. I mean, to me, the figures that most disturb me are those who don't struggle. I mean, that idea that I have this certainty and this worldview and that really bothers me. And I always got the sense that John McCain was somebody who certainly had firm convictions, but there was this struggle. And more than that, there was, I can't think of a better word, but there was a sort of a heart, a bigness of self.
Generosity.
A generosity that I think is so incredibly important, that everything wasn't just a matter of cold calculation and that's what worries me. I see less and less of that sort of thing. Now, there are some American politicians who I think still exemplify that, but they're getting so difficult to find these days.
Yeah. I mean, the current incumbent in the White House, I mean, President Trump was very, he was famously dismissive of John McCain's war record during the campaign, So yep. I guess you would take that as exemplifying that lack of generosity. This guy's a charlatan. He got captured, and, only good soldiers escape and win wars. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of, that's the sort of a typical Trump comment that I think that speaks to something fundamental about his personality, something that I think is fundamentally ungenerous, and I would argue to a certain extent just downright broken.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can talk about that President Trump towards the end, because it'll be useful for our podcast listeners to get the perspective of an American on President Trump. But I think to begin to talk about that, I mean, one of the things I'd like to talk to you about is why is the word socialist so dirty in United States?
Yeah, I think there's a long history of that, certainly, and obviously, if you go far back, there was, in fact, the early 20th century, there was kind of a strong socialist movement in the United States, but it petered out for a variety of reasons. But I think just going back to the 1980s, we saw certainly with the rise of Ronald Reagan and sort of the new conservative movement that I think it ties in really to that whole idea of American, let's say independence, but that sort of can-do, frontier, individualist sort of spirit. And I think just for a variety of reasons, America has never been quite as communitarian, maybe much more individualist than a lot of places in Europe. And so it just never found as fertile ground that sort of idea of, the taking care for the common good and that sort of thing. And so I think that's why socialism is just seen much more as a dirty word, and where it's just part of the American character that just differentiates us a great deal from Europe in particular. I think less from the UK. I mean, there was sort of a similar movement in the 80s in the UK with Margaret Thatcher and that sort of thing. So we can see some parallels, but certainly to a much greater extent in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, like if you look at perhaps the biggest exponent of socialistic, we'll say, politics in the United States, Bernie Sanders. I mean, when I saw him running against Hillary Clinton, I was going to go, oh, I mean, if he actually wins the primary, Americans are never going to go with a socialist ever, Right. I mean, sorry, I guess like Franklin Roosevelt, who was probably the closest American president to what you could call a socialist, or a European-style socialist at least, was still not a socialist. I mean, he was a sort of a modern-day liberal, I guess, who did, expand government in a big way, but that was in a crisis.
Yeah, well, I think part of it also is almost in a way kind of a branding issue. And that certainly you had presidents like Roosevelt, or even more recently in the American experience, presidents like Lyndon Johnson, who were very much, I mean, they promoted programs that one might call, at least approaching socialism, but just by
so Medicare and Medicaid.
Medicare and Medicaid, and even Richard Nixon had some extraordinarily liberal policies. He was interested in this idea of a universal health care and a universal basic income. These were things that came up in his administration. So it's not like a lot of the actual programs are foreign, but I think also in understanding why the United States is so resistant to this, it's important to understand that this idea of socialism is in some ways tied to the idea of communism, rightly or wrongly. And of course, for since the end of, really for most of the 20th century, the United States was essentially engaged in what it felt was like an existential struggle against communism. And so I think in a way we were so oriented toward that. And I think it's difficult for even Americans who aren't at least, I would say maybe 40 years old or older, to appreciate how that shaped politics and life in general in the United States. And so I think a lot of this is just a carryover because it's difficult for us to disentangle socialism from communism. And there was just such a great fear of communism in the United States. And I think there's a lot of that just carries over.
I mean, well, with things like the Cuban Missiles Crisis and the rising Cold War tensions, that makes sense because, this was the same in Europe as well. I mean, I remember, being told about the nuclear bomb and stuff like that in school. I mean, Ireland, where I grew up, was neutral, but if the UK was
right.
Yeah, Fallout is not very cognizant of borders,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was an existential threat, which is why I think we could say lots of Americans on both left and right are skeptical of the word socialism. And if it's an existential threat, that means that this is a matter of life and death, which it was.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And a lot of Americans, I think, see this as sort of a slippery slope type of thing, is that socialism will inevitably lead to this massive loss of freedom, and that's what they're concerned about. Now, I think the logic for that is faulty. I would make a very different argument, but I think that's how oftentimes people of the right see it.
Yeah, and I think... And I'm saying this as an outsider as well. I mean, I think one of the things, and correct me if I'm wrong, that binds Americans, whether on the left and right, is an idea that in some sense government shouldn't be centralized. It should be smaller, or it should be weaker at least. I mean, I getting this from another outsider actually, Tocqueville. He says this in his
Democracy in America.
Democracy in America. Yeah, he says this, that, the idea that central government should be small, and then you have a federal system, right? Where the reign of government should be loose.
Yeah, I think that's also been just baked into our character since even before the United States was a country. Certainly, that sort of fierce independence and local control, and that those things have been important to Americans and part of the way we understand politics and life for hundreds of years now. And so I think that definitely goes into our current skepticism with centralized control.
Okay. So moving on, because there's lots I'd like to get to talk to you about. One of the figures that you're interested in, I guess this is why you're sort of on the centre left and comfortable with ideas from, say, perhaps the centre right, is that you do like Edmund Burke.
Very much. Yeah, right? Very much so.
My fellow Irishman, one of the founding fathers of conservatism. So how is it possible then for someone on the centre left to like Burke? What does he offer the left, do you think?
Well, I guess in a word, I'd say humility. And as I understand Burke, one of his central ideas is that human beings are, very limited creatures, and that we have a tendency to think we understand everything, we moderns of whatever era, that we've figured it out, and these poor unenlightened folks of the past just did not have our advantages and so forth. But time and time again, we found that that's just not the case. And I think that's the argument he makes for tradition, is that things, that the world is a complex place. and that if you think you understand it and you think you can make great changes to it without unintended consequences, you are almost certainly going to be proven wrong. And I would argue, centuries, if not millennia of experience back up that observation. And so to me, the importance of Burke is that we need to check our hubris. We need to understand that we almost certainly do not know all the answers and that our brilliant solutions are going to almost certainly cause a whole bunch of problems that we're not aware of. And so therefore,
unintended consequences.
Yeah, unintended consequences. So therefore, we should proceed with caution. And to me, that's the central lesson I take away from Burke, and why I think both the left and the right should be, should recognize that.
Yeah. And so in a sense, what Burke is doing, he's saying that humans are, what's the word? Imperfect in some sense. And, I mean, that possibly appeals to my own Catholic fatalism as well, but it's something that tempers, I suppose, from your perspective, it tempers the rampant optimism that, say, perhaps you might find on the left sometimes, the idea that you can, that things could be zero sum, all or nothing. You can radically transform society in one go. Yeah, I mean, and that's why I think I'm a person of the center left and not the left full stop, because when you get further left, the proposals start to get a lot more radical, and that's when my inner Burkean kicks in. It says, well, wait a second, I think you're going too far, and we need to proceed much more slowly with a certain respect for the past before we just throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, inadvertently. Another conservative thinker, Chesterton, says that. He says, if you're going to rip, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here and it escapes me slightly, but I think he said something to the effect that if you're going to tear down a fence, you should probably check why it was put up in the first place. I'm also a big fan of Chesterton as well. And I think there's just a lot of wisdom in that. And I would argue that both not only the left has largely forgotten this or just dismissed this as unimportant or a relic of the past, but the right has too. Conservatives, modern conservatives, are really more, I would argue, right-wing reactionaries than true conservatives in that sort of Burkean, Chestertonian sense, because they want to radically remake society as well, just in a different direction. Yeah, and that's interesting to me. Like, I mean, one of the things that strikes me about, positions that they do right, you could maybe say Reagan was like this. You could certainly say Thatcher was like this. And that was that they, for figures at the right, someone like Thatcher, who had, some strong conservative values, traditional conservative values, but was also sort of excessively sort of liberal in an economic sense, there was somewhat utopian about that. I mean, you mentioned this about libertarians as well, is that we tend to forget this maybe, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective, is that people on the right can be quite utopian. Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that it's utopian thinking is just so compelling to everyone. Wouldn't it be great if we could just do these 2 or 3 things and boom, society would be so much better? And yes, it would be great, but that's not how the world works. And I think that that's something that too many people have either forgotten or just never realized in the first place. Yeah. And so do you think then that, do you think the horse is bolted effectively? I mean, do you think that we have moved so far in our politics along, I guess, what some on the left would call neoliberal economic lines, or free marketeer lines? Traditional conservatives are very, very skeptical of rampant markets. Is this something that we can overturn in sort of, say, democratic societies? Well, let's say in your case, an American society. It's something that I worry about and I think about a lot. And I guess I'd like to be optimistic, but honestly, when I look at trends, I see how things are going and try to predict where technology is going to take us, I have a hard time being incredibly optimistic about much of this changing for
the better, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, that is very Burkean in itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a sort of a basic pessimism about human beings and their capacity to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, there's obviously that notion that very modern, Enlightenment notion that, we're on this continual path of progress, uninterrupted progress with maybe a few little fits and starts here. But I tend to maybe be a little more sympathetic to an older view that things might be a little more cyclical and that we can actually have major reversals for extended periods of time. And I think people who don't believe that are maybe, blind to a lot of our history as human beings.
Yeah. Okay. So where we are now, prior to the last presidential election in the United States, on your show, you were very, very critical of candidate Donald Trump. I think I recall. I mean, you saw him as someone who was, I suppose, unfit for the role. Mm-hmm. And do you think that Donald Trump, continuing on from what we've talked about, is someone that has moved, conservatism and has moved America beyond what it's capable of coping with in political terms? I mean, I'm not sure how apocalyptic you want to be.
Sure, no, yeah, but
I'm interested. Yeah, so I'm interested, Mike, in saying where you were then, say, I don't know, October 2016 to where you are now.
Yeah.
How do you think? Where are we with what Trump has brought to the American body politic?
Well, here's a case where maybe I can be surprisingly a little bit optimistic, I think. Maybe it's, some people call it just whistling past the graveyard. I don't know. But my sense of things is that Donald Trump is more likely than not a one-off. He's an extraordinarily unique individual with the sort of background and talents, if you will, that are very difficult to replicate. My thinking and maybe my hope is that he captured a moment in society. He was the right man at the right time, who's sort of, capturing this last gasp of a certain type of America, a certain type of American who's longing for times when, white male supremacy, I guess, was sort of the order of the day, a bygone America. And my thinking is that this will be a one-off, and that once Donald Trump is gone from the public scene, we're going to see at least somewhat of a return to what I would call more normal politics, because I don't think anyone's going to be able to successfully replicate what Donald Trump has done. Number one, because he's such a unique individual. And number two, because the coalition that brought him to power is starting to decline in power, and, in part just because of demographics.
Yeah. That's interesting. And do you think, the message he bought, make America great again, which is, I guess, an essentially conservative idea, that he wants to return to a past that may or may not have been there. He had a message of economic nationalism and sort of anti-global trade. Do you think that he's been able to implement any of his campaign promises?
Oh, absolutely. Certainly, we see it on trade, which is just a continual source of dismay to me. But on the bright side, it seems like even most Republicans, or many Republicans in the United States government, are actually opposed to this. And maybe even more importantly, the business community is very much opposed to this. And so I think the weight of that opposition will almost certainly ensure that at some point in the not too distant future, maybe it will be after Donald Trump is no longer president, that things will revert, because I think just the inexorable logic of free trade and prosperity. That's not to say that on this issue that, there isn't a certain point to be made about the winners and losers of free trade and having to take better care of those who have not benefited from it. But this idea of simply going back to this economic nationalism, I think that just is so wrong at its basis that inevitably we're going to move back to more of a free trade regime.
Right. So do you think, so you don't think, I guess, that he's implemented irrevocable changes within the American body politic?
Correct. But, I think in the American system, the president can only do so much on his own to actually make changes that stick, that are lasting past his presidency. He needs congressional approval. And on a lot of issues, he's just not going to get the buy-in, even from his own party, to make those sort of things happen, which I think is, a very good thing, obviously.
Well, even within his own administration, if Bob Woodward's recent book is to be believed. Yeah, I think that says something perhaps about American politics, doesn't it? Because, if you look at sort of the American executive, it's famously, I guess it's kind of famously Burkean in a way, isn't it? Because it's kind of designed for gridlock. It prohibits sort of radical change. There's very rarely that someone can bring in big changes like, say, which is why Obama's healthcare initiatives were so exceptional, because they were so rare. But it's very, very difficult to introduce hugely deleterious effects because because of the way the Senate is set up, and there's elections that are done in thirds and things like that. It's very hard for someone to gain absolute power. Power is divided. But yes, that Tuckvelian thing again, isn't it? There's a central weakness in government.
Yeah, it's interesting. At least one thing I find interesting is that almost every former U.S. president, when asked about, lessons learned and things that surprised them, invariably one of the things they say is, I thought I'd have a lot more power than I actually have, and this, these are bright individuals, many who have, extensive experience with government. And I think that really brings home how the American system is designed to frustrate radical change. And I think certainly that while it certainly can frustrate me at times, in the end, I think that's a good thing, and certainly, a Burkean type of feature, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, true. You are a true Burkean, I think, at heart at least. Yeah. One of the things, like looking at it from the outside, is that, and again, I go back to the Bob Woodward book here, is that one of President Trump's continual refrain seems to be, it's not fair. It's not fair. This is not fair. Which, which sounds quite childish, in some level. But, he was elected on that. One of the things he said is, what was one of his campaign trails is, this system is rigged. The system is rigged. Do you think he's doing that type of message has done damage to the sort of the legitimacy of American institutions, or do they have the capacity to repel that or revitalize themselves?
To me, that's the greatest concern about the Trump presidency, not his policies, which I think can be, in many cases, will be moderated or reversed, but the damage, and I think it's going to be lasting damage, that he's done to the trust in government and institutions. Now, that's something that's been in great decline since really the late 1960s, early 1970s. But he's jumped on this with both feet, and I think really accelerated it to an incredibly worrisome degree. And I don't know how necessarily we recover from that, or how quickly we can, even if we can at all.
Right. So that is certainly concerning. Yeah, we could probably talk about President Trump all day. I think one of the people on your podcast, I think it might have been an old friend of yours. It was a Trump supporter. And I think they were quite stoic about the whole thing, so they were sort of that's sort of maybe some conservative wisdom there. The idea that it's not all or nothing, or it's not that politicians come and go. There'll be someone else along in a couple of years. This is maybe they're taking the long view of things. Yeah.
I think absolutely. That definitely was that particular person's view, and that, politics is not nearly as important as many people make it out to be, which I think sort of ties into that idea that as people have abandoned greater sources of meaning, like, for instance, religion, that many people have clung to politics or adopted politics as the source of meaning in their lives, and given it an importance greater than what it necessarily merits. But on the other hand, I would say, well, that's perhaps easier to say as a privileged white male person in the United States, when the stakes aren't nearly as high for you as they are for, say, a young black man or something like that.
Yeah. Now, in terms of where you see future trends emerging, I mean, bearing in mind the current US administration, what do you think is, I guess, well, generally, what are the important issues facing American politics in the medium to long term, especially given, the changes that the Trump administration, no more than any administration, will bring in. So what are the parties for the future of the left-wing politics, perhaps in the United States, or where do you see themselves, or do you see a coalition emerging?
Well, I certainly see that, I guess the most important problems that I think are, number one, sort of an unsustainable, fiscal path that the United States is on, in large part, I would argue, because we're big fans of lowering taxes and not decreasing spending, which eventually is designed to fail. And obviously, I, as a person of the left, at least to a certain extent, I believe that we need to really radically re-examine that in terms of really asking those who have more to give more for the common good. And certainly that's not a policy that's very popular on the right, obviously, with Republicans just passing over $1 trillion tax cut. I think the other issue that I think is of literally existential importance is the climate change issue. And I think there's certainly a strong consensus on the left about that. Now, as to what we're necessarily going to do about that, I don't know. My hope is that once Donald Trump is out of office, we will revert to our support for the Paris Accords and go even further than that. I don't know if that's going to happen, but certainly my hope is that it will, and that it's not too little too late.
What do you think, in addition to what you said, I mean, that's clearly going to be issues facing all politicians in the long term. Do you think, I mean, this seems to be something that will strike to the heart of economies around the world, but in particular former manufacturing economies such as the UK and I think such as the United States, and that's automation. Is that something that you have anxieties over?
Yeah, I think that's a big issue as well. And I think that's going to fundamentally alter, politics and society and really everything. And I've done a lot of reading on this and actually talked to some people who are experts in this field. And it seems to me that we're facing inevitably a very different future with mass, or underemployment. Now, I know some people are optimistic saying that, well, we've always found jobs for people, but I think this is a difference in kind, and that society and politics are going to be forced to adapt, and it could be a pretty bumpy ride until we do.
Yeah, I mean, and that begs the question to be, do you think, I mean, you're a political scientist, I mean, you mentioned Trump's his tax cuts legislation. And to my mind, that type of legislation always works in the short term. I mean, you always get some bumps, because, because in businesses and things like that, have got more money to spend and therefore can hire more workers and whatnot. But usually in the long term, at least from what I've looked at, this tends to be, can be disastrous. Yeah. But I guess, I mean, that's not really my question. I guess my question is like, how can you inject long-term thinking into a short-term business-like democracy?
And that's the million-dollar question. I mean, and I don't know, I don't know that you necessarily can. I think as the system was originally conceived, it was actually considerably less democratic, and it allowed the people who were in charge, the elites, that's become a dirty word now, but I'll use it in a non-pejorative sense. The elites too maybe engage in more long-term thinking, but now everything in our society and politics pushes against it. And I think it's become so much harder to do. And that certainly is, I think, a problem, not just in the United States, but with democratic societies in general around the world.
Absolutely. And I don't have any better answers than you on that. Yeah. And do you think, where are in terms of the American left, and where do you think, I mean, what type of candidates do you think would be able to, run against Donald Trump's message? I mean, traditionally, and I might be wrong on this, but traditionally, incumbents in American presidential elections have a very good chance of being re-elected. Clearly the Hillary Clinton model, that sort of centre-left, sort of fiscally prudent centre-left or left on social issues model did not work. So do you think that the left needs to radically transform its ideas? Is it time for an American socialist?
I really don't think so. I think that's exactly what, pushes in that direction of that utopian thinking that I think would be disastrous on the other end of things. And so I think the sort of, unfortunately, again, because that's so popular, those are the sort of politicians on the left who we see emerging as the strongest possible challengers to Donald Trump. But to me, the sort of person who has the best chance of bringing back a type of sort of moderate sanity to the system is a person like, I would say, like a Joe Biden, who was, a vice president under Barack Obama, who exemplifies, again, that older tradition. I think he shares a lot of things in common with, well, you mentioned John McCain. I think he shares a lot of things in common with that older tradition. And I think unless we return to that tradition, then I think the future looks pretty bleak, actually.
Okay, and again, that's probably probably another conservative position, that you're, a return to an older tradition.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I'm not saying that's right, wrong, or right, but I mean, it does strike me that, and I think probably this is true in Britain as well, it's that there's, I mean, Donald Trump is approximately 70 years old, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Joe Biden is old, I mean, they're older people, and
yeah. Yeah,
the world that they grew up in is not there, but it's something that they represent, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the problem. When I look at younger politicians who exemplify this, there aren't a whole lot of names that come to mind, unfortunately.
Yeah, and leftists, young leftists tend to be impatient.
Yes,
as well.
Absolutely.
And that's not a judgment. That can be quite fruitful as well. So I think I only have a couple of more questions for you, Mike. You have some forthcoming elections coming up in the United States. So these are congressional elections, I think.
Yes.
Is that right? Yes, yeah. So I'm wondering, what's your take on that? What are the things you think to watch out for? Is this going to be the American electorate? Giving, having a go at Trump, I guess.
One of the felicitous features in our system is that there tends to be reactions to agendas that are seen as radical, whether they're on the right and the left. And so there is political scientists have observed that almost invariably the president's party tends to lose seats in the legislature in what we call midterm elections between presidential years. And so it's a near certainty that Democrats will gain seats in both in the House and perhaps in the Senate. And there's a strong likelihood that they will take control of the House of Representatives, which would certainly put the brakes on any of the more ambitious parts of President Trump's agenda. And this is, I should point out, exactly what happened in 2010. When Barack Obama was elected, in fact, with large enough legislative majorities to do things like Obamacare and financial reform, and there was a reaction from the electorate in that point. And so this is the kind of thing, it's sort of almost a built-in check that makes it difficult to do things that are too radical for too long in our system. And it's one of the things that gives me at least a certain amount of hope for the future, I suppose.
So that's a good place to end, maybe. Yeah. I mean, it does say to me that the gravity of American politics does tend to go to the center.
Yes.
Given that we've talked about sort of your background, your politics, we've had a really interesting discussion about all these different things. Can I ask, are you still a believer? Do you still believe in the American project, the Republic?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And if I didn't, I wouldn't be teaching. I wouldn't be talking to you. I wouldn't be podcasting myself, because I believe it's an idea worth fighting for. And that's what I'm doing.
Okay. So, I think we should end on, we should talk a little bit about your show, The Politics Guys, if you want to give a plug for that. There might be some European listeners might be interested in telling about it. So I really enjoy it. I recommend it. What do you do on that show, Michael?
Yeah. Well, Well, basically, every week, we have a conservative and a liberal, and we talk about usually it's the top 3 or 4 stories in American politics that week. And we try to engage in, a conversation and try to understand where the other side is coming from. And again, that gets to that idea of, we've been talking about before about not talking past each other, but understanding, the fundamental beliefs of the other side, where they're coming from, and looking for commonalities, looking for shared ground that we can perhaps use as a basis to move forward. I think, and my co-hosts on the show think, that there's far too little of that in American politics and in society in general. And so we're trying to carve out a little oasis of that and attract people to that. And, with any luck, that will grow from there.
Absolutely. And, let me follow up that recommendation. I really enjoy the show as well. And what I like about it is that, for someone who's a bit of an aficionado of American politics, from listening to your show, I just get a really good rounded view of an issue.
Well, thanks.
Without knee-jerk partisan Twitter yelling.
We try really hard to do that. And also we try to listen to our audience, because we have listeners on both the left and the right. And whenever someone suggests to me that maybe I'm, parroting talking points or something like that, I take that seriously, because I think it's so important for us to always, examine our own, preconceptions and our own approach. Because if we're not being reflective people, then I think it's so easy to fall into that sort of unfortunate political posturing and not really thinking about why we believe what we believe.
A grandstanding free zone.
Exactly.
Okay, Michael Baranawski, thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, it's been my great pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Well. Our theme tune is Love the Government by Il Papa Giraffe and is licensed under Creative Commons. You can follow us on iTunes or your preferred podcast app.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans. The government, hug the government.